Present to you our next speaker. Now, I'm very lucky because, as you know from things like the MP's expenses scandal and that, a lot of people don't have much faith in the people running the country. But funnily enough, where I live in Lewes in East Sussex, it just so happens that my MP is the good gentleman standing with me here. And Norman Baker is somebody that's been basically hailed as well, one of the few, not that I want to embarrass him here, who actually stands for, shall we say, truth. And particularly, I would say you've probably annoyed more people in Parliament than any other MP, which is fantastic news, because Norman is somebody that will not let something go. If it's not right, he will chase to the end. And of course, one of the issues that Norman has spent a long time investigating is the death of Dr. David Kelly. And he is going to share with us his findings today. So please give a huge hand for Norman Baker.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, for that introduction. And I'll get used to this odd contraption in my head, no doubt, in a few minutes. It does seem like it's Lewes on tour, with Andy coming first and me second. But Lewes is a very civilized place, so if you haven't been there, do come along and visit us there. I'm sorry, Andy, I missed some of your talk, but I did catch your introduction on conspiracy theories. And I'm called a conspiracy theorist because I dare to challenge the official version of events. People say it's obviously nonsense. What the government tells us must be right, mustn't it? After all, it's not as though we've had a Bulgarian injected with the right and tipped umbrella to bus stop, is it? Or we've had an Italian with links to the Masonic Lodge found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge, or a Russian dissident poisoned with polonium-210 in a Japanese restaurant. These things just don't happen in this country. So obviously, the official version of events must always be true. My approach to the David Kelly issue has been not to assume that so-called conspiracy theories are false, nor to assume that they're true, but simply to look at the facts in each individual case and see where those facts take me. And I became interested in this when the Hutton inquiry first reported in January 2004. I was interested as a member of the public before that, but in January 2004, when the Hutton inquiry had its report published, you may recall on that occasion, the headline in the paper the next day was "Whitewash." And there was this disbelief in the public at large that Lord Hutton had concluded on that occasion, negotiating between the BBC and the government, that the BBC was guilty of everything and the government was guilty of nothing. And that led to a spontaneous demonstration of support for Greg Dyke at BBC Television Centre when people came out from the BBC to support him out there outside the building. Reminded me of the Prague Spring of 1968. And I thought, if Lord Hutton got it so badly wrong on the main focus of his inquiry, which was the BBC versus the government, could he really be trusted to get it right on the issue of David Kelly's death? There then appeared a number of letters in the newspapers from leading doctors and medical experts who queried the conclusion that Lord Hutton had reached regarding David Kelly's death and simply suggested it was clinically impossible for him to have died in the way that Lord Hutton described. I then looked into it behind the scenes a little bit, and the more I looked into it, the more unhappy I became about the conclusions in respect of David Kelly. I then had an article published in that most progressive of newspapers, the Mail on Sunday, when I set out my initial thoughts, and that led to the biggest number of emails, letters, phone calls, postcards I've had from the public on any issue, even more than MP's expenses, as a matter of fact. Over 1,000 people contacted me at that point from that one article, all of whom said they were unhappy with the government's and Lord Hutton's conclusions, and all of whom, bar two, supported me and asked me to carry on with the investigations. So I took a year off my party's front bench and investigated the matter, and the result is the book, which a quick advert for it, which you can get a copy of outside for 10 quid, and the conclusions are all set out in there. Let me just refer now to the politics of the matter before I go on to Dr. Kelly specifically, because at the beginning of July 2003, nobody had heard of Dr. Kelly, and by the end of the month, everybody had heard of Dr. Kelly. And the reason for that largely was that he was outed by the government, and it was by the government, as the source of the information given to Andrew Gilligan, the BBC reporter, who broadcast famously at 6:07 in the Today programme one day the suggestion that the government's dossier on the Iraq war, or the case for a war effectively, had been, quote, sexed up, unquote. And it became clear, and subsequently admitted by David Kelly, that he was the source of that information. Now, that led to a whole range of political consequences, of course, including eventually I think it led eventually to the fall of Tony Blair. It was a major factor in the Labour Party losing confidence in him. But Tony Blair's version of events was that on this business of how dangerous Iraq was, whether we were 45 minutes from disaster, whether there were weapons of mass destruction present in Iraq, was that his official version was that in the lead up to the Iraq war, he was doing his best to avoid war. He was trying to go through the UN route. At the same time, he was getting increasing levels of concern expressed by the intelligence services about the threat posed from Iraq. But he didn't finally decide to go to war until a couple of weeks beforehand. That was actually what he told the liaison committee in Parliament, that a decision to go to war had been taken only shortly before action was committed. That turns out, of course, not to be the case in any shape or form, because the reality is rather different to that. He'd said on 8th of July 2003, I decided we could not avoid conflict in a few days before the vote on 18th of March, because it was then that it was obvious that we could not get a second UN resolution that delivered an ultimatum to Saddam. Up until that point, I was still working to avoid the conflict. That's what Tony Blair said. On the 18th of March, he took the decision. Well, that rather doesn't square very much with a memo, a confidential memo produced inside Downing Street, which made its way into the public domain just before the 2005 general election, and which actually, ironically, because it was so close to election day, rather got smothered in the pre-election bonanza going on in the papers. But that memo, taken by Matthew Rycroft, the Prime Minister's private secretary, said this. This was taken on 23rd of July 2002, so roughly 9 months before Tony Blair said he was committed to going to war. This is what he said. This is what the memo said. C, that's a quaint name for the head of MI6, reported on his recent talks in Washington. There was a perceptible shift in attitude. Military action was now seen as inevitable. Bush wanted to remove Saddam through military action, justified by the conjunction of terrorism and WMD. But the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. So what was the reaction of the British government to this clear warmongering from President Bush? Was it to say, this is terrible, we should use our influence, as our so-called special relationship says, to bring the Americans into some sort of legal framework? We should try to discourage them from launching illegal wars based on regime change? No, this is what the Foreign Secretary said in that recorded memo from Downing Street, 23rd of July 2002. Jack Straw, it seemed clear that Bush had made up his mind to take military action, even if the timing was not yet decided, but the case was thin. Saddam was not threatening his neighbours, and his WMD capability was less than that of Libya, North Korea, or Iran. We should work up a plan for an ultimatum for Saddam to allow back in the UN weapons inspectors. This would also help with the legal justification for the use of force. So far from trying to stop the war, I'm afraid our leading politicians were actually conniving with the Americans to arrange for it to be started. And the UN weapons inspectors were not there to stop the war, but to facilitate it by provoking Saddam into his refusing access for them. That's the reality of the position. And it's very different to that constructed in the dodgy dossiers and presented to Parliament. The 45-minute claim is particularly sensitive. That was over the newspapers. 45 minutes from doom, I think, was a headline in The Sun. And it played no small role in convincing a number of parliamentarians who were instinctively unhappy and concerned about the idea of going to war with Iraq. It tipped them over, so they voted for the war. I might say I didn't vote for it, but it tipped a number of honest politicians who were really concerned over to Tony Blair's side. And what we now know is that whole case was constructed on a false premise. There was very little intelligence suggesting there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There was some intelligence suggesting there was. But the version of the dossiers, we now have the various versions of the dossiers which are in the public domain, show that at each stage the language became stronger and stronger until, as Hans Blix, the UN weapons inspector, chief weapons inspector, described it subsequently, the British government changed question marks into exclamation marks. Alistair Campbell was personally involved in drafting the dossiers with his mate John Scarlett, who afterwards was rewarded by being made head of MI6. And Alistair Campbell's textual changes, which changed words like may to are, for example, I mean, these are intelligence judgments which he was making as a Prime Minister's press officer, those were incorporated in the final version which emerged for parliamentarians and the public at large. The case was hyped up beyond belief. And David Kelly and others in the intelligence services knew that, and there was a great deal of evidence that before the Iraq war, the intelligence services themselves were expressing to friendly journalists considerable doubts as to the case being put by the government and dissociating themselves from the very strong, unequivocal language which the dossier included. And of course, David Kelly, who, by the way, had been given a license to talk to the media, was making those views known to Andrew Gilligan and perhaps others. Interestingly, MI5 quietly withdrew the claim about the 45 minutes threat. When did they withdraw the claim? They withdrew on July the 17th, 2003, which takes us neatly to the day of David Kelly's last appearance on this planet, July the 17th, 2003. What happened on that day then? The events of that day, let me just try and see if this machine works. By the way, that's just David, that's the security clearance. I don't know if you can see that from there. That's the security clearance for David Kelly, which states that he had access to top secret material of UK origin and also top secret material of US origin. So he was by no means a small junior cog in the wheel, as the government subsequently attempted to portray him. He was had access to the most classified material in terms of biological and chemical weapons. So what happened on that particular day, 17th of July 2003? Let me give you the official version of events. The official version of events is this, that David Kelly, having been outed actually by the government, found himself in a very, very difficult position. He wasn't used to the limelight in that way. He found it very uncomfortable. He was then subject to an interrogation by the Foreign Affairs Committee, kind of almost like an East European show trial, on the Tuesday, the 15th of July. That was covered by the papers. There was a famous exchange with Andrew McKinley when he asked him if he thought he was chaff. By the way, to be fair to Andrew, Andrew was trying to be helpful to him. Andrew subsequently got castigated for that. That was unfair. But in any case, it was an uncomfortable experience for him. This is the official version. He then came out. He felt terribly depressed. He thought his career was going to be over. He mulled it over a couple of days. And his state of mind was then such that he decided to commit suicide. The official version goes that he left his house where that red dot is in Southmore, that's near Abingdon. He then walked up by whatever route he took, and I'll come on to that in a second, up to Harrowdown Hill. He took with him a knife he'd had since boyhood, and so some coproximol tablets. He sliced into his artery in his wrist, took some coproximol tablets to kill the pain, and was then found dead. That's the official version of events. It is wrong and unjustifiable, unsustainable in almost all regards. Let's deal first of all with the state of mind which he had. If you read Simon Hoggart the next day in The Guardian, you'll see that David Kelly at the end of it was clearly hadn't been the best day of his life, but he was relieved it was over and actually was quite positive. The next day, the Wednesday, not generally known, he also gave evidence to another parliamentary committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee, which happened behind closed doors. When that meeting took place behind closed doors, he was in a much better mood. He was even making jokes. I know that because I've got the transcript of the committee meeting. He was back to normal, in other words. And on the Thursday morning, he was so back to normal that he was sending emails to friends saying the worst was over. He was looking forward to going back to Iraq. And indeed, he asked the Ministry of Defence that Thursday morning to book a flight to Iraq for the following week, which they duly did. In addition to that, he was looking forward to his daughter's forthcoming wedding. And he also had the issue of his wife being ill at that particular point. In fact, she retired to her bed that day. So it would have been particularly out of character, I think, and rather callous for him to have decided to have committed suicide on that particular occasion. But states of mind can be interpreted either way. Sometimes you might argue that people who look as if they have recovered still have some suicidal tendencies. So I don't rest my case on that analysis, but I think it is instructive to look at the evidence such as it is. And I think it's also instructive to talk to his friends, as I have done, other weapons inspectors and so on, who have said that he was a very, very strong character. He had, after all, gone in and handled in a very professional and effective way the Iraqis in the early 1990s and their illegal weapons program then. He'd been in to handle the Russians or the Soviets and their illegal program and exposed that, again, around the same time. So you might argue, having dealt with some of the hardest people in Iraq and Russia, he wasn't going to be put off by a bunch of MPs on the Foreign Affairs Committee. So that's the state of mind, and it's not conclusive evidence either way, but I would suggest that the evidence, such as it is, would suggest that suicide is far from likely to have been in his mind. So what about the evidence that Lord Hutton subsequently in his inquiry relied upon in terms of the manner of death that's supposed to have occurred? Let me just show you the various suggestions as to how he got up to Harrydown Hill. The last person who saw him alive allegedly was Ruth Absalom, one of his neighbours, who saw him at that second red spot. We don't quite know how he's supposed to have got there, but I imagine he walked up by the stream or the A420 through the fields. Then we don't... Did he do that? Then that's where Ruth Absalom thinks he went next. She said he went off in that direction, which is the opposite direction to Harrydown Hill. That was her evidence. But we don't know how he got there. There is some suggestion a farmer saw him on what would be a sensible route to Harrydown Hill, but he subsequently withdrew that statement. Afterwards, Ruth Absalom, unfortunately, developed, I think it was Alzheimer's, and by the time I got around to trying to find her, she was not in a position to give evidence any further than that. But anyway, what we do know is he left his house at 3 o'clock or thereabouts on that Thursday afternoon. We know that he was then officially found round about 8 o'clock, 8:30 in the morning, the following day at Harrydown Hill. Now, as I say, the suggestion was that he had killed himself by cutting an artery in his wrist and taking painkillers. That doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And it was that point, those points in particular, which have been queried so vociferously by medical experts subsequent to the events of 2003. And the doctors and others concerned, you may have seen from the newspapers in the last couple of weeks, I've not given up on that. They have actually produced a formal legal document, and they intend to take legal action if they can to force the government to reopen the inquest and to get hold of the post-mortem, which has never been released, the post-mortem details. So they are absolutely convinced about that, and there's a group of doctors with whom I'm in contact who want to pursue that matter. Why are they so concerned? Well, we're told that David Kelly cut into his wrist and therefore bled to death by cutting the ulnar artery. The ulnar artery is a tiny artery about here in the wrist, which is only accessed by cutting through nerves and tendons, so a particularly painful place to insert a knife into the body. It would be excruciatingly painful, as a matter of fact, to have cut there. It's also a rather curious place to choose, because if you're a watcher of television programs, crime thrillers, then inevitably the cut will come across here at the radial artery, which of course is much bigger and will release a great deal more blood. Actually, even cutting the radial artery is unlikely to be successful if the object is to kill yourself. A study in US prisons in the 1990s showed that of 275 prisoners who'd attempted to kill themselves by cutting the radial artery, only one actually succeeded. And a great deal more blood would have come out of the radial artery than the ulnar artery. I'm told, I've never tried this myself, that if you want to be successful, then you would actually put yourself in hot water and you would slice your arm that way, rather than, and that may be successful, but I don't suggest you try it at home. But what is certain is that the ulnar artery seems to be a most ridiculous artery to choose if that's your intention to commit suicide. Indeed, I asked the national statistician, Karen Dunnell, how many people had died in the United Kingdom in 2003 from cutting the ulnar artery. You may be interested in the figure? It was 1. That was the official response I got from her. It's also the case that when the paramedics came on the scene, they weren't at all clear what was supposed to have happened. Why? Because there was no blood. It's most curious that someone can bleed to death, and yet there's no blood. Where has it gone, one wonders? Lord Hutton thinks it all seeped into the ground. It's also the case that if you take the evidence, such as it was presented at the Hutton inquiry, the only blood that was on David Kelly's clothes was on his arm, the left arm, where there had been an incision. And for some reason, there was a small piece of blood on, I think it was the right knee, the size of a 50p piece. There was no blood on his right arm. Now, of course, if you cut into yourself, then the heart's still pumping, and the heart will pump blood, and it will shoot out. And the paramedics themselves give evidence to suggest, both to me and the Hutton inquiry, and on television, that they've seen rooms where there's been a complete mess, looking, quote, like an abattoir, unquote, and yet the person has survived, because the fountain effect of blood is very, very messy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you lose sufficient quantities to die. But there was not a single drop of blood on his right arm or his right sleeve. So we're expected to believe that not only did he bleed to death in the ulnar artery, but the quantity of blood which came out entirely missed his right arm and all seeped into the ground. I think it's difficult to give much credence to that particular suggestion. Then, of course, there's the fact that David Kelly probably knew more about the human body than most people. And he worked at Porton Down. He'd been there since 1984. And quite frankly, had he wanted to commit suicide, I think he might have been able to do so in a rather more effective way than choosing a very uncertain way, which had caused no deaths so far at all that year, according to the national statistician. So that suggests that, so we're asked to believe that not only was he suicidal, but he was also in some way, his mental capacity had been impaired, choosing such a means. And he was also masochistic because he chose to cut through nerves and tendons, and he was completely callous about his wife who was ill and his daughter about to be married. I simply don't believe that's the man that we're talking about. There's another interesting fact came out as well, because there was no evidence given by the police officer in charge of the inquiry. Believe it or not, the Hutton inquiry managed to avoid interviewing the police officer in charge of the inquiry. In fact, they managed to avoid even mentioning him. He was Chief Inspector Alan Young of Thames Valley Police. He's now been promoted subsequent to the death of David Kelly. He's now Superintendent Alan Young. But I finally got hold of Alan Young, and he didn't want to see me, but actually my own Chief Constable in Sussex lent on him, and he had to go and see me. I asked him, and I formally asked him in writing, what fingerprints were on the knife. Such a simple question, isn't it? You would think the Hutton inquiry might have picked that up as an obvious question to pose. Asked what fingerprints were on the knife. Well, it may surprise you to know there were no fingerprints on the knife. So we're asked to believe that David Kelly had managed to hold the knife in a particular way. He wasn't wearing gloves, by the way. To hold the knife in a particular way as a contortionist, leaving no fingerprints on the knife whatsoever as he sliced into his ulnar artery. And there's another curious issue about the cutting as well, because I spoke to my Pedersen. My Pedersen was a person who knew David Kelly, I'm almost tempted to say better than anybody else. They were certainly very close. She's in the US Army. She's widely reported to be a US spy. At least that was a view of her two husbands that she's had. They both said that on the record. I've spoken to her at some length, and an interesting character she is. She offered to give evidence to the Hutton inquiry, but Lord Hutton was told by the police that she had nothing of importance to say. What she told me, which seems to me that might have been important to say, is that shortly before David Kelly died, he'd had an injury to his right arm, she thinks to his elbow, and so bad was it that when they were in a restaurant together, he was unable to cut steak with his right arm. So here we are also seeing David Kelly now apparently using an injured arm, which can't cut steak, to cut into his right wrist as well. It is, if it were not tragic, it would be unbelievable in terms of the flimsiness of the case which is presented. No fingerprints in the knife, and then there's other evidence as well from the official cause of death, which needs to be challenged. Let me come on to the coproximal tablets. There were 30 coproximal tablets which had been taken from his house. That's the implication of the evidence. There were 3 blister packs found in his pocket. There were some coproximal tablets in his house. They did come from the same batch, albeit a batch of several million. So it's a reasonable assumption to suggest that those tablets came from his house. 3 blister packs in his pocket of his jacket. By the way, it's interesting, this jacket, because all the reports the next day in the paper said he went out with only a shirt and trousers on, but a jacket was subsequently found at the scene. No one's quite married up the inconsistency between initial reports from the police and what subsequently was found at the scene. But leaving that aside, the jacket found at the scene, which is either a blue or green wax jacket, according to which report you believe in the papers, contained 3 blister packs. Those 3 blister packs were empty bar 1, so 1 tablet helpfully left there for some reason, 29 removed, with the implication you're supposed to assume that he had consumed 29 tablets. Well, again, as I say, David Kelly knows about the toxicology of the body, and swallowing 29 coproximal tablets is unlikely to kill you, but it is likely to cause liver damage if you're unsuccessful. So would you take a gamble of not being successful, cutting the ulnar artery, which after all is a gamble, and leave yourself with potential liver damage? However, be that as it may, there's also the evidence that Mai Pedersen would have given to the Hutton inquiry had she been asked, which is that David Kelly had an aversion to swallowing tablets. So here's just another masochistic streak apparently we have in the man, that he's going to swallow tablets when he doesn't like doing so. There was a water bottle at the side of the body, which was officially, this is the official version, smeared in blood. I asked the police, our good friend Alan Young, what fingerprints were recovered from the water bottle. And surprise, surprise, there were no fingerprints recovered from the water bottle. There's also the fact that if you're going to swallow 29 coproximal tablets, as is what's implied by the evidence, and we were invited to believe that's the case, you will swallow a great deal of water. If you don't like swallowing tablets, you're going to take some water with those tablets. You're going to drink quite a lot of water to swallow 29 tablets. And you're also going to swallow more water, as a matter of fact, if you're losing a lot of blood, because the natural instinct from the body is to take water in to compensate for the loss of blood. So you might think this tiny little water bottle, the sort you buy for an inflated price at railway stations, that sort of water bottle, won't be empty. Far from it. It was about 2/3 full, this water bottle. So he'd hardly drunk any water at all to compensate for the loss of blood or to swallow 29 coproximal tablets, and he managed to avoid leaving fingerprints in the bottle at the same time. And then there's the fact that if you look at the official evidence from Alex Allen, the toxicologist who reported to the Hutton inquiry, so this is the official version of events, Alex Allen tells us that he had in his stomach less than half a tablet of coproximal, and even if all the tablets had metabolized into the bloodstream, he had, at the very most, consumed 1/3 of a lethal dose. So I think even the official version of events suggests that coproximal is not a cause of death, which leads me on to the next slide, I think. That's the official cause of death. The third reason is a supplementary reason. It's not regarded as the main reason. There's an extra factor in there by the in the official record of death. By the way, his doctor, who had seen him about a month beforehand, said he found no evidence of that. But they're the official reasons of death for death. And there's the death certificate issued by the Oxfordshire coroner, which shows that. Cause of death, 1 and 2, and then the additional cause underneath. Now, the interesting thing about this death certificate is the date of issue. That's the interesting thing for me anyway. The date of registration at the bottom, 18th of August 2003, a month to the day after his body was found. Why is that interesting? Because Lord Hutton had been asked to chair an inquiry to find the cause of David Kelly's death and had only begun taking evidence 4 days before the death certificate was produced by the Oxfordshire coroner. So what is the point in producing a death certificate, giving the reasons for death, if the inquiry to establish those reasons has not yet taken evidence or reported? However, that's the sequence of events which took place. Actually, under the Coroner's Act 1988, there is a provision for an interim certificate of death to be issued. And the reason you do that is to allow the body to be buried or whatever you're going to do with it in good order, whilst not reaching definitive conclusions about the cause of death. One wonders why there wasn't an interim certificate issued rather than the final certificate on that particular date. And in fact, the relationship between the coroner and the government and Lord Hutton is quite an interesting one, because obviously when a body is found dead, a violent death, or under suspicious circumstances in your jurisdiction as a coroner, you'll want to have a proper inquest. That's standard procedure in law. That inquest will be a rigorous, proper legal procedure. It can subpoena witnesses. It will require people to give evidence under oath. It can find them guilty of perjury if they lie. It can have proper processes for cross-examination. It has high hurdles in for conclusions which are reached. For example, the hurdle for a suicide verdict to be reached at the coroner's inquest is beyond reasonable doubt. I just challenge you to suggest any way in which, given the evidence I've just presented to you this morning, anyone can conclude that he committed suicide beyond reasonable doubt based on what we've heard and what I've discovered and others have discovered since his death. But the coroner wasn't allowed to have his inquest. He began to have his inquest, but then it all got sidetracked. Now, why did that happen? Because of a decision taken very early on to appoint Lord Hutton to have an inquest of a different sort, an inquiry, but not a proper inquiry, a non-statutory inquiry. Now, that led to some exchange between the coroner and the government, and if I can just find the relevant section from the book, page 87. Subsequent to all this, as part of my investigations, I spoke to Harriet Harman, who was the relevant minister at the government Department of Constitutional Affairs. She was actually very helpful, and when I put a question to her, she said, well, you probably want to have all the correspondence. I hadn't actually asked for that, but thank you very much. And she said, here, I'll release it all to you. And she sent me the correspondence between the government and the Oxfordshire coroner, which is interesting in its own way. The Oxfordshire coroner, who had been told at this point that Lord Hutton was going to take over, pointed out to the government in writing, in a letter of the 6th of August, as you all know, a coroner has powers to compel attendance of witnesses. There are no such powers attached to a public inquiry. So he was clearly expressing his doubts about the process which the government had put in place. And after a further exchange of letters, the Lord Chancellor, Lord Falconer, had his office right back to the coroner on the 12th of August, saying this: the Lord Chancellor considers that the cause of death of David Kelly is likely to be adequately investigated by the judicial inquiry conducted by Lord Hutton. Accordingly, I am instructed by the Lord Chancellor to request that you adjourn the inquest in compliance with Section 17A. So the Oxfordshire coroner was bundled off the case. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm instinctively uncomfortable with the idea of a government minister telling a coroner to get off the case when it comes to investigating a death within his jurisdiction. But that's what happened. Nevertheless, he did manage to issue a death certificate, which, of course, doesn't bear scrutiny for the reasons I've given. So how did Lord Hutton get there in the first place? because the official time of events, as I say, David Kelly's supposed to have gone for his walk at 3 o'clock on that Thursday. This was the same time, by the way, as Tony Blair was in the US addressing Congress when he received 16, or was it 17, standing ovations from the US Congress for giving intellectual justification to the decision by George Bush to go to war in Iraq. He left America a hero. And of course, as Tony Blair was leaving America to standing ovations, David Kelly was lying dead at Harrowdown Hill. It's also interesting analysis that on that day, as I mentioned, MI6 withdrew the claim on 45 minutes. They withdrew that intelligence very quietly. Also on that day, the House of Commons rose for its marathon summer recess at 4:55 that day. So when David Kelly's body was found very shortly afterwards, of course, there were no MPs able to raise the matter in Parliament for several months. That was very unfortunate, of course. But Tony Blair was officially told that Kelly was missing at 2 o'clock Eastern Daily Time, 7 o'clock our time. He landed in Tokyo some 8 hours later. During that 8 hours, he managed to discuss the matter with Lord Falconer. He managed to discuss it with Alistair Campbell and perhaps others as well. They had decided not to let the coroner investigate matters, but to hold an inquiry under Lord Hutton, or to hold an inquiry. They had decided it should be a non-statutory inquiry. They had decided that Lord Hutton would be the appropriate person to chair it. Lord Falconer had sounded out the Master of the Rolls as to whether that was satisfactory or not. He'd received his assent for that. Lord Falconer had been to see Lord Hutton to discuss the matter with him. He discussed the terms of reference. Lord Hutton had mulled them over and said yes. And before the plane landed in Tokyo 8 hours later, it was announced to the public at large that Lord Hutton would hold an inquiry into this matter. So you see, government can act with speed when it has to. And of course, that meant that the newspapers were immediately focused on the Hutton inquiry and what that would do, rather than on David Kelly's death, which rather got sidelined because the Hutton inquiry was seen at the time to be all about the government versus the BBC, as indeed it was, and not about poor David Kelly. Now, the important thing about this inquiry, this may sound rather techie, but it's actually a very important point. The inquiry was a non-statutory inquiry. What that means is it has no more formal basis than me talking to you in this room today. Nobody gave evidence under oath. Nobody could be subpoenaed. Nobody could be found guilty of perjury. There was no proper cross-examination. None of the normal processes of law applied. And therefore, in this most sensational and questionable and important death, the individual's death was investigated to a lower standard than any other death would be in this country and had been for decades. That is the truth of the matter. It's an extraordinary situation, but that is the truth of the matter. Now, that ability to remove the coroner and replace him with an inquiry had been established in 1988 under the Coroner's Act, and done so for a good reason. It was in order to prevent repetitive inquests when the evidence given would be the same, for example, in a train crash. And it was also going to be more efficient and cause less stress to families in that situation to have one inquiry when one set of evidence can be given. It's been used on 3 or 4 occasions since then. In every occasion, apart from David Kelly's, it's been a statutory inquiry with proper procedures in law under the 1921 Tribunals Act. And on every occasion since then, apart from David Kelly's, it's investigated multiple deaths. So this is the only occasion when a single death has been investigated by such an inquiry, and the only occasion when a non-statutory inquiry has been used rather than one with proper legal processes. That is, I think, something which ought to concern people if they have proper concerns about how we do things in this country. I certainly think it should do. Now, Lord Hutton's inquiry itself was, frankly, a disgrace. And I'm very sorry to say that, but that's the only way we can describe it. Lord Hutton himself, if I can find the relevant page, admitted that it wasn't a rigorous inquiry. He wrote subsequently in a racy publication called the Inner Temple Yearbook 2004-2005. I'm sure you've all seen it. said this: "At the outset of my inquiry, it appeared to me that a substantial number of the basic facts of the train of events which led to the tragic death of David Kelly were already apparent from reports in the press and other parts of the media. Therefore, I thought there would be little serious dispute as to the background facts. I thought that unnecessary time could be taken up by cross-examination on matters which were not directly relevant." That's what he wrote himself about his own inquiry subsequently. It's also quite clear that there were a failure to look into key evidence, even when it was presented to Lord Hutton on a plate. For example, let's take the position of Dr. Nicholas Hunt, the pathologist, who we know from the information revealed to me by Harriet Harman, actually changed his view on the cause of death in early August. We don't know how he changed his view of death, but we do know it from the letters which went between the coroner and the DCA. That might have been important. He was asked at the Hutton inquiry, at the end of his giving evidence, if he could tell from his examination if there were any signs of a third-party involvement in David Kelly's death. This is what he said: "The features are quite typical, I would say, of self-inflicted injury if one ignores all the other features of the case." What did Lord Hutton say to that? He said, "Is there anything else you'd like to add as on the circumstances of David Kelly's death?" Dr. Hunt said this: "Nothing I could say as a pathologist, no." What does that mean? Nothing I could say as a pathologist, no. Did anyone say to him, "What do you mean, Dr. Hunt?" No, the next statement from Lord Hutton was this: "Thank you very much." That was the end of his evidence. That's all we have from Dr. Hunt, until he popped up on Channel 4 in 2004 suggesting that the coroner's inquest ought to be reopened. That's the official pathologist who reported the Hutton inquiry. So Alex Allen has already said that there was insufficient coproximal to kill him. Dr. Hunt asked for the inquest to be reopened. It doesn't seem there are very many people actually supporting the conclusion which was finally reached on that occasion. And then there's the evidence of the police. The police, let me just say something about the police. They were called very late in the day by Mrs. Kelly at midnight, some 9 hours nearly after David Kelly had gone for his walk. He went for a half-hour walk or thereabouts nearly every day. He always took his mobile phone and he would ring if he was going to be late. So it is a little peculiar that such a time was allowed to elapse before the police were actually called. We know that colleagues from the MOD did try and ring him about 4 o'clock, an hour after he left, and the mobile phone was at that point switched off. But we don't know whether Mrs. Kelly tried to ring him or not. Presumably she did. Anyway, the police were called at 11:45, came round, and they made a cursory search of the house. It's a reasonably large house, it was, and therefore I suppose it's not unreasonable to look in the house in case he was somewhere in the house and hadn't been spotted. Unlikely, but worth making the check. Nothing wrong with that. You might then think the police would concentrate on going out to try and find him in the woods and elsewhere round his house in Abingdon, near Abingdon. Well, they may have done some of that. There were a couple of helicopter flights. And by the way, the times given for the helicopter flights in the Hutton inquiry, this non-statutory inquiry where no one can be found guilty of perjury, subsequently were completely contradicted by parliamentary answers I had from the Minister of Defence, which told me the times and origins of the helicopter flights, which are rather different to the ones Lord Hutton was given. But what did the police do apart from this? Well, they came back at 3 o'clock in the morning and erected a huge communications mast in Mrs. Kelly's garden, which we were told at the time was 45 feet. I've subsequently found out with a Freedom of Information request it was, from memory, 90 feet high, an extraordinarily high communications mast. Why do they want that? Surely they can communicate quite well without doing that at 3 o'clock in the morning. There seems to be no reason that you're going to do that, unless perhaps you want to, for example, communicate with a plane flying from, say, the US to Japan. But they came back at 3 o'clock in the morning and did that. What they also did then was throw Mrs. Kelly out of her house. Well, I'm sure throw is a bit strong. They asked her to leave her house and stand in the garden in the middle of the night while they then went through the house in great detail. Why? Surely Dr. Kelly wasn't there. Were they interested in finding Dr. Kelly, or were they interested in finding something else which was more important to them than finding Dr. Kelly? And certainly the suggestion was that a number of computers and so on were removed from Dr. Kelly's house and taken away. Then the police evidence themselves is largely contradictory. I haven't got time in the 10 minutes I've got left to go through in what way it was contradictory. This is what Lord Hutton, however, said about the massive contradictions in the police evidence, and there was a massive contradictions in the police evidence. Those who try cases relating to a death or injury know that entirely honest witnesses often give evidence as to what they saw at the scene, which differs as to details. In the evidence I have heard from those who saw Dr. Kelly's body in the wood, there were differences as to points of detail, such as the number of police officers at the scene, whether they're all in uniform, the amount of blood at the scene, and whether the body was lying on the ground or slumped against a tree. These differences do not cause me to doubt that no third party was involved in Dr. Kelly's death. And he subsequently went on to say that the fact that the police officers had given entirely contradictory evidence demonstrated that they were all honest, because had they been dishonest, they would have concocted a story which was the same. That was the logic which Lord Hutton deployed. It is, frankly, beyond belief. Now, I'm therefore convinced, I was therefore convinced beyond reasonable doubt, to use that legal definition, that Lord Hutton was wrong and that David Kelly must have been murdered. It clearly wasn't an accident, it clearly wasn't natural causes, and I believe, for the reasons I've indicated, and go into in more length in my book, that suicide is simply not a credible explanation, and therefore there's only one explanation left. Now, I might say I take a political risk reaching that conclusion. Can I leave myself open, as Andy said in the first section, to being sidelined or put in a box saying, unreliable. But if the facts take you somewhere, that's what you have to say. If you're honest, you have to just present the facts as you find them. And it seems to me those are where the facts lead you. Having said that, I'm not a replication for a proper procedure. I believe in proper procedures, and what needs to happen now, in conjunction with the Iraq War inquiry that's been established under Sir John Chilcot. And by the way, I'm not personally convinced that 4 sirs and the Baroness are going to necessarily reach the right conclusions on the Iraq War, but that's what we have. In parallel with that inquiry into the Iraq War, we need to have a proper inquest into David Kelly's death, and I think that is something which we owe him, as a matter of fact. And I very much hope that will come about, and I'm pursuing that at the present time. But in my inquiries, as part of my research for that year, I wanted to go through what I thought the possible explanations could be for David Kelly's death. Who would have a motive, in other words, for murdering him? I came across a number of interesting colleagues, or interesting people who made themselves known to me, including some with security service connections, some with CIA connections. Others have been involved in, for example, Project Coast in South Africa. Project Coast, I spoke to Wouter Basson, who was a man behind Project Coast, which was expressly set up to find ways of killing people without leaving a trace. He was very happy to discuss it with me in great length on the phone. Ironically, perhaps he was now employed as a surgeon himself, a heart surgeon in South Africa, busy saving lives, when he will freely admit that he caused a great number of deaths when he was doing that work for the apartheid regime in South Africa at the time. So there seemed to me a number of possible explanations for, or motives, if you like. One was because David Kelly had information in his head which, had it been released, would have been very damaging indeed, even more damaging than the furore that came about with him being found dead in the woods. A second explanation might be that they simply wanted to make it plain to others, that someone did, that talking to the press and talking to journalists has its own consequences, and to discourage others from taking part in an activity of that nature. And then I wanted to look at which countries might have an interest. Obviously, the US and the UK were closely involved with David Kelly. So was Iraq. So in other ways were Russia, Israel, and South Africa. So it was a huge task to take on. I had a number of leads given to me, and when I wrote my Mail on Sunday article, I had probably 20 people came forward with specific information about his death and his circumstances, which was useful in taking matters forward. One of those was somebody who, with connections with the police and security services, whom I met eventually in Exeter St. David's Station. We went to a rather grubby wine bar, and there he told me his story, which is he'd made inquiries through his contacts, his professional contacts with Thames Valley Police, and asked to speak to the relevant police officers there, Alan Young and D.C. Coe, who was the police officer who was primarily involved at the scene of the where David Kelly was found. The phone was put down on him, apparently, and he tells me an hour later he was rung up anonymously asking how he would like a full VAT and tax inspection. His affairs was running a small business at the time. He didn't want that, he better shut up. And that was the end of that conversation. He didn't shut up because he then came to see me. Well, in fact, before that, he went to see a friend of his in MI6, and that friend of his took him outside the pub where they were speaking and told him in the fresh air in the car park that David Kelly's death had been, quote, a wet disposal, unquote, and he should keep well away from it if he knew what was good for him. I should say this man's bona fides have been checked out, not just by me, but been checked out by the BBC. He was very keen to make it plain that he wanted to be taken seriously, and 2 BBC journalists separately went through what he said and went through his history and have confirmed both what he said insofar as it can be ascertained as accurate, and secondly that he is a reliable witness and he is who he said he is. Subsequent to that, and after I met him and he told me all this, I then rang him about 3 months later to check on 1 or 2 facts to get them right for the book. He told me the week before I'd rung him, his house had been broken into. Nothing of value had been taken. All the silver and everything else had been left where it was. The only thing that had been taken was a laptop from a cupboard upstairs in the bedroom on which was his material related to David Kelly. Nothing else had been taken at all from his house. And I had a number of other interesting contacts which are set out in the book. Perhaps the most frightening contact I had was with an individual, a man who came to see me in the House of Commons on a pretext, and he came to see me actually about David Kelly. He told me he had information in relation to exactly how David Kelly had been killed, which he said had been with an injection in his bum with one of these substances which the South Africans and others had developed, which left pretty much no trace. He went through who he thought had done it. He said he was in that circle. He set out the information for me and promised to keep in touch. I then, he did then promise me, it was very difficult to get hold of, as you might understand. We had a rather circuitous way of making contact. He then promised me something in writing, which would be very important. It didn't arrive. I was reluctant to ring him because of the nature of our contacts, but finally I did ring him. It subsequently turned out that shortly after he had contacted me to promise me something in writing, he'd been invited to receive something of importance in a park in West London. When he got there, he was in fact assaulted, badly beaten up, and a cellophane bag was placed over his head, only removed shortly before he suffocated. It also turned out that phone calls had been made from his mobile to his father the night before, saying that he was suicidal and wanted to kill himself. He has not been very keen to make very much contact since, which I can entirely understand. So the reasons why I've reached the conclusions I have, which I haven't had time to go into, are set out in the book. There was no obvious one overriding conclusion as to who would have had a motive. And let me just say that. There are lots of 10% solutions as to who might have a motive. On the face of it, there's no obvious solution. I mean, Tony Blair, you might argue, and the government didn't really want to do this because they ended up with a huge problem on their hands, a huge furore on their hands. The US, he wasn't particularly important for the US. It was a British problem. Do the Russians really worry about what happened 15 years beforehand? And if they did, why did it manifest itself at that time? Seems unlikely. Israel, well, you know, he was a friend of Israel in many ways, so that seems unlikely as well. South Africa, well, no, we dealt with South Africa at Porton-Down, and the links between Porton-Down and South Africa haven't yet fully come out, though Andrew McKinley, the Labour MP, is busy pursuing that particular matter. So actually, it comes down to one of 2 explanations. First of all, let me say I believe he was killed by Iraqis, which may not sound the obvious thing to conclude, but that's, for the reasons I give in the book, that's what I have concluded. What's less clear to me is for what purpose he was killed and who commissioned it. And again, the possibilities, I think, which are still uncertain, are one was that it was an Iraqi issue through and through, and the second, for reasons I give, and secondly, that it may have been odd elements in the British establishment which may have secured arm's length assassination by using Iraqis. Now, at the end of the book, I go into that speculation, and I want to be perfectly plain to you, and I've tried to be so in the book, where I am certain of my facts and where I make assessments and make the best guess as possible. What I've been very keen to do is not over-egg the pudding. I've found out facts and I've presented them, and I invite you to reach your conclusions on them. What is certain is that this is not going to go away. This episode in British history is a disgrace. It's a disgrace in political terms. Let me just read for you, finally, comments on our former Prime Minister, produced by, let me see if I can find it, by the former chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee, Sir Roderick Braithwaite. This is the state that our politics has got in now. This is what Sir Roderick Braithwaite said, former chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. A spectre is stalking British television, a frayed and waxy zombie straight from Madame Tussauds. This one, unusually, seems to live and breathe. Perhaps it comes from the Central Intelligence Agency's box of technical tricks, programmed to spout the language of the White House in an artificial English accent. There is another possible explanation. Perhaps what we see on television is the real Tony Blair, the man who believes that he and his friend have the key to the horrifying problems of the Middle East. Mr. Blair's prime responsibility is to defend the interests of his own country. This he has signally failed to do. Stiffened opinions, but often in the wrong. He has manipulated public opinion, sent our soldiers into distant lands for ill-conceived purposes, misused the intelligence agencies to serve his ends, and reduced the Foreign Office to a demoralised cipher because it keeps reminding him of inconvenient facts. He keeps the dog, but barely notices if it barks or not. He prefers to construct his foreign policy out of self-right to sound bites and expensive foreign travel. I don't think I've ever seen a diplomat, let alone someone in that position as chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee, produce such a scathing attack on a serving, as it was then, a serving Prime Minister. But I have to say that I think there's some justification in that. Our politics was extremely badly damaged by the events of 2002, 2003, in a way we've not recovered from. The BBC has not recovered its credibility since that date. If this happens again, how would the BBC handle it? No one can answer that question with certainty. We were taken into an illegal war on the basis of a pack of lies given to Parliament, given to you as residents of this country. And I think that needs to be sorted out. There's a political resolution which is yet outstanding. We'll see if John Chilcott's inquiry brings that. There's a resolution about the independence of the media and the effectiveness of the media, given that most of this stuff they didn't bother finding out themselves, to be sorted out. That needs to be sorted out. And you might want to look at another book by a Lewis resident, since I'm plugging Lewis, my colleague Nick Davis, a Guardian journalist, and his book Flat Earth News, which sets out in depressing length the ineffectiveness of the media these days. But there's also matters to be sorted out regarding Dr. Kelly. He was a good man. He was a man who did more than anybody perhaps, to reduce the threat of biological and chemical warfare in this world. He was a stout servant not to this country but of the world through UNSCOM and other bodies to which he belonged. And he didn't deserve to be found dead in a field in Harrowdown Hill, particularly with the juxtaposition of Tony Blair receiving 17 standing ovations at the same time from the US Congress. He is entitled, I think, to two things. One is a proper inquest into what actually happened, and secondly, into a posthumous acknowledgement of the work he did for this country and for the world. This is unfinished business, and I intend to carry on until it is finished.
Ladies and gentlemen, Norman Baker.